3 days before I was supposed to sign the paperwork on the restaurant. My father and I had spent 6 years building together. He sat across from me at our own kitchen table and told me he was cutting me out. My sister sat beside him, holding his hand, nodding along like she'd rehearsed it. Hey Reddit. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who posts this stuff. But I've been sitting on this for almost a year and I still don't know how to explain it to people in real life without watching their faces go blank. So here we are. My name's Joel. I'm 34, and up until about 18 months ago, I thought I had things pretty figured out. Not perfect, but solid. I had a trade certification in culinary management, a decent apartment in Kitchener, and a real working partnership with my dad that I'd poured almost every good year of my adult life into. We ran a catering operation out of a commercial kitchen on the east side of town. Small staff, maybe 11 people at peak season. We did corporate events, wedding receptions, a few city contracts for gala dinners. Nothing flashy, but we were good at it, consistent. The kind of business that doesn't make the news but keeps the lights on and then some. The original plan, the one we'd shaken hands on back when I was 28, was that I'd buy in as a full co-owner once we hit a certain revenue threshold. Dad would stay on as a partner until he wanted to retire, and then the business would come to me. We never put it in writing because it never felt necessary. He was my dad. I was his son. That felt like enough. I should probably explain my sister. She's 2 years older than me, and her name is Claudine. She lives about 40 minutes away in Guelph, and married a guy named Brent about 4 years ago. Brent is the kind of man who wears a fleece vest to every occasion including funerals, speaks with total authority about things he's read exactly one article about, and has never once held a job longer than 14 months. When Claudine met him, he was doing something in commercial real estate acquisitions, which turned out to mean he made cold calls for a brokerage that let him go when the market slowed. Since then he'd done a stint in insurance, tried his hand at dropshipping, and was most recently describing himself as a strategic consultant, which as far as I could tell meant he sent LinkedIn messages and attended free webinars. I didn't hate Brent. That's the honest truth. He was harmless in isolation. The problem was that he was never in isolation. He was always there, always orbiting, always dropping little comments about how the catering operation was underutilizing its assets or how we should be exploring vertical integration. My dad, who had never once in 63 years been described as easily impressed, started listening. That was what scared me. Claudine had always been the favorite. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I've done enough thinking about it to say it the way you'd describe weather. Just a fact. Dad lit up around her in a way he didn't around me. My achievements were acknowledged. Hers were celebrated. I made peace with it a long time ago. Or at least I thought I had. Things started to shift about 2 years before everything fell apart. Brent started showing up at the kitchen on non-event days, walking the floor, asking questions about our supplier contracts, our margins, our client retention rate. I mentioned it to my dad once, gently, and he said Brent was just curious. That family takes an interest. I let it go. Then Claudine started coming to our monthly planning meetings. Just to listen, she said. Just to understand the business better. She sat in the corner with a notepad and didn't say much, and I told myself it was fine. Maybe it was good for her to understand what I actually did. How much went into it. Then one Tuesday in March, my dad called me into the office at the back of the kitchen, the one with the frosted glass window and the mini fridge that had been broken since 2019. And he said he'd been thinking about the future of the company. He said Brent had put together a proposal, a restructuring plan. He slid a folder across the desk. I opened it, 42 pages, professionally formatted, with a cover page and section dividers and a table of contents. I remember staring at the font and thinking, he actually had it printed at a copy shop. This wasn't a casual idea. This had been prepared. The short version was this. Brent proposed that the business be incorporated under a new holding company, with my father holding 51% of shares, Claudine holding 24%, Brent himself holding 15% as a strategic advisor, and me holding 10% as an operational employee with a fixed salary. Not a partner. An employee, with 10% of a company I had spent 6 years building from permit applications and cold calls, and 18-hour days on Christmas Eve. I put the folder down very carefully. I asked my dad if he'd read all of it. He said he had. I asked him what he thought. He said he thought it was worth considering. That was the moment I understood that the conversation had already happened somewhere without me. This wasn't a proposal being floated for discussion. This was a decision looking for my signature. I didn't yell. I didn't walk out. I asked him to give me a week to read it properly and think it through. He said that was fair. I spent that week going through every document I could find that related to the business. Our original operating agreement, such as it was, email threads from the early years where he'd used the word partner to describe me, payroll records showing my contributions. I also spent a lot of that week not sleeping, but that part goes without saying. At the end of the week, I went back to him and laid out my concerns. The equity split was insulting. My institutional knowledge of every client relationship, every supplier deal, every kitchen process had been reduced to a salary line. And Brent, who had never once worked a catering shift in his life, would hold 15% simply by virtue of being married to my sister. My dad heard me out. Then he said Claudine and Brent had really stepped up lately. That Brent had strong business instincts, that maybe I was being too emotional about it. Too emotional. About the thing I'd given my 30s to. I told him I wouldn't sign the restructuring agreement as written. He said he'd hoped I would see it differently. Then my sister walked in, which told me she'd been somewhere nearby the whole time, and she sat down and said, very carefully, that this was about protecting the family's legacy, and that she hoped I could be mature enough to see that. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked at my dad, then I left. The next few weeks were the quietest stretch of my adult life. I didn't go into the kitchen. I answered emails when I had to, forwarded scheduling questions to our floor manager, kept things technically running, while I tried to figure out what I was even dealing with. My dad called twice, both times to ask when I was coming back in, not to ask how I was. My mother had passed 4 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I bring this up because after she died, I think my dad started looking to Claudine to fill some of that space in his life, that emotional center of the family. And Claudine, who had always been close to him, stepped into it naturally. Brent came along with her. That was the sequence of events, as best I understand it now. I had a lawyer look at our original operating agreement. It was informal enough that enforcing a verbal partnership claim would be messy and expensive. The lawyer said I had a case, maybe, but it would cost me significantly to pursue, and the outcome wasn't guaranteed. He suggested I try to negotiate a better equity position before going that route. I tried. I went back to my dad with a counter proposal. 35% for me, 35% for him, 20% for Claudine, 0% for Brent because I was not going to accept Brent as a shareholder in a company he had never once contributed labor to. My dad took it away to think about. A week later he came back and said Claudine and Brent felt my counter wasn't workable. He used their names. Claudine and Brent. Not I feel or I think. He said what they felt. That was when I knew I was not losing a business negotiation. I was losing my father. 2 weeks after that, I received a formal letter from a law office in Waterloo. It outlined, in clean professional language, that my role in the company was being reclassified to that of a contracted employee. My previous compensation structure would be maintained for 90 days during the transition. If I did not sign the new employment contract within 30 days, my access to company systems and facilities would be suspended. It was signed by my dad. His actual signature. On law firm letterhead. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I called my closest friend, a guy named Tom who I'd met during my Red Seal apprenticeship, and I read it to him over the phone. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Joel, you should talk to an employment lawyer today." He was right. But first I just needed someone to confirm that what I was reading was real. That it wasn't something I'd misunderstood. It was real. I called my sister that night not to argue. I genuinely wanted to understand what had happened, how we had arrived here. She picked up after 4 rings. "I know why you're calling," she said. I asked her to explain it to me. Her version. I said I wanted to actually hear it. She said that Dad was getting older and needed proper business structure around him. She said I had always been resistant to change. She said Brent had a real skill set that the company needed, and it was only fair he be recognized for what he was contributing. I asked what he was contributing. She said strategy. I asked for a specific example. She paused. Then she said I was being hostile, and that this was exactly the kind of attitude that made it hard to work with me. I thanked her for her time and ended the call. What happened next I found out through our floor manager. A woman who had worked with us for 3 years, and who I trusted completely. She told me that Brent had been coming in regularly while I was absent. That he'd been asking the staff questions about their hours and pay. That he'd suggested to my dad that 2 of our longest-serving catering staff could be replaced with part-time contract workers to cut overhead. She told me she'd overheard a phone call, where Brent told someone he was planning to pitch the business to a private equity contact he knew in Mississauga. Private equity, our family catering business, the one my dad had started when I was in grade school, that still had a handwritten recipe binder in the back office, that my mother had assembled in 1998. I didn't do anything with that information right away. I didn't have a plan. I was still in the stage where everything felt too raw and too surreal to act on. What I did do was start keeping records. Every email, every voicemail, every text. I'd been doing this instinctively since the folder had been slid across the desk, but now I was systematic about it. I didn't know what I was building toward. I just knew that the shape of what was happening felt like something I should be able to prove later. The 90-day transition window passed. I did not sign the new employment contract. My access to the scheduling system was suspended, then my key card for the commercial kitchen, then my company email. Each one came with a short administrative notice, professional language. No emotional acknowledgement of what any of it meant. My dad didn't call during any of it. The person who'd call, a few weeks after my kitchen access was cut, was our accountant. She'd been doing the books for the company for years, and was one of the most straightforward people I'd ever dealt with. She left a voicemail saying she needed to speak with me about something and asking me to call back when I could. I called her back. The same evening, she told me she'd been asked to sign off on a set of financial filings that she wasn't comfortable with, that in the process of preparing to restructure the corporate accounts. Certain historical records had come to her attention. Specifically, records related to a provincial catering contract we'd held 3 years earlier. A large municipal gala that had been publicly funded. The figures submitted to the client did not match the internal records she'd been given. I asked her to explain what she meant. She said it carefully. The way professionals say things they want to be sure are understood correctly. She said it appeared that the invoices submitted to the municipality had been inflated, that the difference between what was billed and what was actually spent had not been properly accounted for. That she had tried to raise this internally, and had been told to leave it alone. I sat there holding my phone and I thought about Brent talking about strategic consulting. I asked her what she was going to do. She said she wasn't in a position to ignore it. That as a CPA she had professional obligations. That she was letting me know as a courtesy because she had worked with my family for a long time, and wanted me to understand that what was coming wasn't personal. I thanked her. After we hung up I went to the window and stood there for a while watching the street below. I want to be very clear about what I did not do next. I did not call anyone. I did not contact the municipality. I did not speak to any journalists or file any complaints. I had nothing to do with what happened. That's not me claiming moral high ground. That's just the truth. I had documentation of my own situation, and I was still figuring out what to do with it. What happened next came from somewhere entirely outside of me. About 3 weeks after that call, I woke up to my phone showing 44 missed calls. It was a Saturday morning. I made coffee. I stood at my kitchen counter watching the number climb as my phone buzzed against the tile, and I counted 6 more calls come in while I waited for the coffee to finish. When I opened the door they were all there. My dad, Claudine and Brent. My dad looked like he hadn't slept. Claudine's mascara had run in 2 thin lines down her face. Brent, for the first time since I'd known him, looked like a man who understood that something had gone badly wrong. "You need to tell us what you did," my dad said. I stepped back to let them in, more out of habit than anything. I poured myself a coffee and did not offer them one. I asked what he thought I'd done. Brent cut in, his voice higher than usual. The accountant had filed a report. The city's audit office had opened an inquiry. The contracting firm that handled procurement for the municipality had already suspended the business's eligibility for future contracts pending review. And someone had sent a package of documents to a regional CBC outlet. Emails, internal cost summaries, a comparison of what was billed versus what was spent. "You had copies of everything," Claudine said. "You had access to all of it." I looked at her. "I had access to everything until your husband had my key card canceled," I said. "Which was months ago." She didn't have an answer for that. My dad sat down heavily in one of my kitchen chairs. He looked older than I'd seen him look in a long time. He asked me quietly if I had talked to anyone about the financials. I told him the truth. I had not. I didn't know who had sent anything to the CBC. What I knew was that our accountant had told me she had professional obligations. That I hadn't been able to change what she was going to do, and I hadn't tried. Brent stood up fast. "She wouldn't have known any of it to report if you hadn't been poisoning the well. You were in her ear for years. You..." "Sit down," I said. I said it quietly. He sat down. I told them I hadn't sent anything to anyone. That I had my own documentation about how I'd been removed from the company. And I intended to use it through proper legal channels. That what they were dealing with from the city audit was their problem. Not mine. That I hadn't made it their problem and I wasn't going to solve it for them either. Claudine started to cry. Not the composed, careful kind of crying she did in difficult conversations to signal emotional investment. This was something more genuine than that, messier. She said they could lose everything. The business, the contracts. She said Dad had already had one conversation with a lawyer about exposure. I looked at my dad. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the table. I thought about all the times I had looked to him for something and found him looking somewhere else. I said, "I'm sorry this is happening, but I didn't cause it. You made choices about how to run things, and about who to trust with what. And now you're living with what those choices produced." I wasn't cold when I said it. I wasn't performing anything. I was just saying the true thing in the room. Dad looked up then. His eyes were red around the rims. "I handled things wrong with you." "I waited," he said. "Brent had ideas, and Claudine was enthusiastic, and I thought it could work, and I should have talked to you differently." Claudine put a hand over her face. Brent was studying the pattern on my kitchen floor. I said, "You didn't just talk to me differently. You had me served a legal notice reclassifying me as an employee of the company I spent 6 years building. You stopped calling. You let me be locked out of a business with my name in its client files." Dad nodded slowly. He didn't argue with any of it. I told them I needed them to leave. I said I wasn't doing this out of anger. I just needed to think. And they being here wasn't helping me think. They left. Brent didn't say anything else. Claudine paused at the door and started to say something and then didn't. When they were gone, I went and sat on my couch for a long time. The CBC story ran a few days later. It was regional, but it got picked up and shared around. The headline was measured, careful in the way regional journalism usually is, but the substance was plain enough. Inflated invoices on a publicly funded municipal contract. A company under review. Names mentioned. Not mine, theirs. The city's audit process moved slowly. The way those things always do. But the consequences didn't wait for it. 3 corporate clients quietly declined to renew their contracts. The municipal eligibility suspension held. 2 of the catering staff, including the floor manager who had kept me informed, found other positions, because the work simply wasn't there anymore. She texted me to let me know she'd landed somewhere good. I was genuinely happy for her. Brent's name disappeared from the company's public-facing materials. I noticed because I checked out of something that wasn't quite curiosity but wasn't quite not. My sister stopped posting about the business on her social accounts, where she had previously been a fairly regular presence. My dad called me about a month after the story ran, not to ask me for anything. Just to talk. He said he'd been speaking with a financial advisor about what a scaled-down version of the business might look like, something smaller, without the municipal contract ambitions. He said Brent and Claudine had decided to step back. He sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. He asked if we could have coffee sometime. I said yes, not immediately. But eventually. I meant it, that's the complicated part. I wasn't performing forgiveness I didn't feel. It's that the version of my dad, who had sat across from me with that restructuring folder and said Brent had strong business instincts, was not the only version of him that existed. He was also the man who had taught me to break down a whole chicken when I was 11. Who had driven me to my Red Seal exam in a February snowstorm. Who had stood at the back of the room at my mother's funeral and looked completely lost in a way I had never seen before or since. People contain more than the worst thing they do to you. I don't know how to explain that better than that. It doesn't make the worst thing okay. It just makes the whole person more complicated than a clean story would allow. I did eventually have coffee with him. A place near his house in Cambridge. The kind of diner that has a specials board written in marker that never seems to change. We sat in a booth by the window and he told me he'd been talking to someone, a counselor, which surprised me a little. He said he thought he'd spent a lot of years trying to consolidate things, to pull everything under one roof, and that he hadn't paid enough attention to what that was doing to some of the people inside that roof. I asked him if he'd known about the invoice discrepancies when they were happening. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had seen some numbers that didn't line up, and had asked Brent about them, and accepted an explanation he probably shouldn't have. I thought about that. About what it means to accept an explanation you probably shouldn't have. I told him I wasn't going to pursue the legal claim. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because I didn't want to spend the next 2 years in that. He nodded. He said he understood. He said he'd make it right another way. I didn't ask him to define that and he didn't offer to. We'll see. What I do now looks pretty different from what I was doing 2 years ago. A colleague I'd worked with on a few events reached out about a consulting contract, helping a hotel group in Waterloo redesign their banquet service operations. It turned out to be a good fit. I've taken on 2 more clients since then. My own name on the invoices, my own decisions. No family meeting required. There's a woman I've been seeing for about 4 months. She works in urban planning, very different world from mine, which I think is part of why it works. She asks good questions and listens to the answers and doesn't try to reframe what I've been through as a lesson I should be grateful for. That last part matters more than I expected it to. She asked me once whether I missed it. The business, the kitchen, all of it. I said I missed the version of it that existed in my head for a long time. The version where it was genuinely mine, and my dad and I were building something that would outlast both of us. That version never fully existed outside my own imagination. And I think part of me knew that even before the folder got savus. But you hold on to versions of things because they keep you moving forward, and then at some point you set them down because they're too heavy to carry with your hands. I still do anything useful for that. I still have the original recipe binder. My floor manager managed to get it out before her last day, and passed it to me quietly. Handwritten tabs, my mother's handwriting on most of them, a coffee ring stain on the lentil soup page, that's been there since, before I could drive. It sits on my kitchen shelf now, and I don't open it very often. But I know where it is, and that feels like enough. Some things don't need to be resolved. They just need to be carried somewhere better.